Good afternoon, and welcome to our next Effective Electronic Patient Record webinar. Today we're going to be talking about integration and reporting. I'd like to welcome you. We have registrants from over 21 countries, and it's great to see so many interested in the challenges and opportunities of electronic patient record implementations. Welcome back to those of you who have attended some of our previous webinars, and welcome to those who are joining for the first time. The focus of our sessions is really on how to create those effective partnerships necessary to succeed in EPR implementations. We highlight some of the common pitfalls and also the areas that you might need support, where your vendor will be asking for your leadership and your focus in delivery. We also look at the key strategies necessary for healthcare practice transformation. After all, the reason why we do these implementations is to transform healthcare for our patients. So today we are going to be talking in our fifth webinar about integration and reporting. And we have two remaining webinars on sustainability and optimization in July and interoperability and system integration in September. So today, I will be introducing you to our team. Mark and I are very pleased to welcome Dan Kinsella and Mitchell Bailey from our US practice. They're very experienced and senior practitioners who focus on integration and reporting respectively. So I'll just ask Dan to introduce himself. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Fran. I'm Dan Kinsella, and I'm a managing director, career healthcare and IT guy, formerly a CIO at a health system in the US. And I lead our analytics practice for providers in the US. Very pleased to be with you today and share some of my experience. Mitch?
Thanks, Dan. So Mitch Bailey, I'm a senior manager of the firm. I've been in the firm 10 years. I've got about 20 years experience in healthcare information technology. I've done large-scale healthcare implementations with Cerner, with Epic, with a number of our largest academic medical centers and health systems in the US. And I've also done some work in the UK as well with the NHS. So really excited to be here and happy to share some of our knowledge with everyone on this call.
Thank you both. It's great to have two of the best to share their knowledge and insights today. So I'm just going to walk through the agenda. But before I do, I want to say, please do ask any questions. Just drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We really welcome your interaction and your thoughts and any questions that you have. And we've protected a section of today, 15 minutes, to really answer those questions for you. So we're going to talk about integration and reporting in turn. Mitch will go first and talk about the integration landscape, how to approach your strategy, the project planning, and the whole interface delivery lifecycle, particularly how it interacts with other aspects of the program that we've already spoken about in this series. And he'll conclude by reviewing some best practices. Dan will then talk about the exciting and ever-evolving area of analytics and reporting, looking at how to blend your EPR with your enterprise analytics approach and the data lifecycle management framework. And then think really futuristically about some of the analytics of the future. So I'm just going to now talk about that governance slide. So you've seen this if you've joined other webinars each time. And we always like to ground our conversation on this governance slide, because effective governance leads to effective decision making and ensuring that your EPR program delivers the guiding principles and the overall vision that has been set out. So you'll be familiar with the pyramid and the layers of governance that we show there in the middle. What we'd like to do now is just talk about the key success factors and guiding principles as they relate specifically to integration and reporting. And I'll hand over to Mitch to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. And like Fran said, for those who have attended some of our previous sessions, this model is familiar and it lays out the well-structured governance for an EPR implementation. I can attest to his effectiveness. I've seen it used on several projects and several implementations with very good impact. The model shows, how the teams are built, how risks are escalated, how decisions are made. But both the integration and reporting teams and the components of their work should be layered into this model at all levels. Technical teams at the base of the pyramid are established there, and that's where their strategies are developed and where a large percentage of the decisions are made. But to ensure the success of the overall program, all levels of governance need to be made aware of things like integration and reporting scope, any changes to that scope, guiding principles for how your new system will connect to all your downstream and ancillary systems, and data governance in general to ensure overall alignment across the whole program. Doing this will ensure that these work streams that we're going to talk about in depth here in a little bit are not only tightly aligned with program governance, but also with the other key work streams that will invariably be affected by the decisions that you make and the plans that you put forward. So with that, I think we can start walking through the first section of the presentation, which is integration. Here's our first slide. We're really going to dive into integration as it relates to an EPR implementation. And I'm going to walk you through what it is, how to build a strategy, and some insights on the life cycle and the development on a project. So let's move on to the next slide. Sorry, the one up, sorry, I didn't think go. Let's go back up to the start slide. There we go. So what do we mean by integration? As Fran pointed out earlier, we're going to talk about integration and reporting, but the reason why they're together is because it's all about data. Integration is the exchange of data across the healthcare enterprise, whether that be clinical data like lab results or radiology images, financial or billing data, or even data generated by medical devices. All of it is critical to patient care and hospital operations, and it needs to be moved around an organization effectively. Healthcare data is typically used using a protocol called HL7, which stands for Health Level 7. I'm not going to get into a deep dive on that protocol, but in short, it's a bar delimited standard that defines how clinical and operational data is categorized, how it's structured, and how it's sent and received. It's event-based, meaning something has to happen in the context of patient care to trigger the message to be sent and received. For example, scheduling an appointment, an admission into the hospital, or labs being ordered. The mechanisms of moving that data around consist of the sender of the message, the middleware interface engine, and the receiver of the message. In the middle of this page, you're going to see what we call a sun diagram, which is a visual representation of an entire integration landscape. I wanted to level set and show you how it all could look. This is an EPR-centric view, and it's a way of viewing the world from an integration lens. Here you can see all the components. The EPR in the middle, and generally would have its own interface module it uses to connect to the outside world. The interface engine, which most organizations will use to route and transform messages throughout their system. And then you see the downstream and ancillary systems that connect to the EPR, like your lab or your radiology systems. The last thing I'll point out on this page is that while HL7 has long been a traditional way of moving data, many organizations are starting to modernize and do things differently with things like application program interfaces or APIs. And they do this using a recently developed or updated standard called FHIR, or Fast Health Interoperable Resource, which is a lighter, more agile protocol developed by the HL7 folks that allows you to move data in a more modern, on-demand fashion, and it enables greater capabilities, especially in the areas of mobile and web development. We can go to the next slide. So on this slide, we wanted to give you a picture of some of the key components of the integration landscape we talked about a bit on the last slide and show you who the main players are in each of the areas. First thing to consider is the EPR. And I don't need to define what that is. I think that's why we're all here, but a few of the largest names that we see in this market, in the global market, are Cerner, Epic, Allscripts. Each of these have a decently large presence in the global market. I think Cerner and Epic are probably the two largest. Each of them have their own pros and cons, but essentially EPRs are the source of your truth for your clinical and administrative data. As we discussed, it is good practice to utilize an interface engine to move the data. The majority of these basically do the same thing. They're very similar in a lot of cases, but the ones that we typically see are Infor Cloverleaf. InterSystems has an engine that's pretty ubiquitous. MuleSoft is out there. We're starting to see it gain traction. IBM has an engine. There's a number of them out there, but some things to consider with these engines are cost of ownership and licensing. Availability of skilled resources is something to think about. You can't always find people that know specific ways to develop on each one of these engines. And then what it means to upgrade or bolt on future tech advancements for each one of these engines. Moving on, the next component of the landscape is, and it was one that it could probably have its own webinar, is medical devices. Devices like ventilators or monitors across the enterprise collect tons of real-time data like vital signs and readings. That data also needs to be sent to the EPR. Generally, those devices won't be integrated in a many-to-one manner, and they require even an additional aggregator or a consolidator of that data before it's sent to the engine and then into the EPR. There are a few vendors that do this in the market, and I've listed a couple of below. Masimo and Capsule are a couple of examples, but some key considerations here include which devices you're going to be integrated and whether you want to use a hardware solution to solve this issue or a software solution. Some of them are hybrid, they use both, but take a look at what you have out there and take a look at which one makes sense to fit into your landscape. And finally, like everything, like we said, everything is moved using a protocol. And I'm not going to repeat everything we just talked about with HL7, but it's the standard, and FHIR is the one that a lot of people are starting to use and starting to be recognized and realized in this market. So we can move on to the next slide. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to walk through what needs to happen from an integration perspective as it relates to the implementation of your EPR. Before anything happens on the project, before you design anything, you build anything, or you test anything, you need to lay out an effective and widely approved strategy. It's essentially the plan for the plan, how you're going to do everything, guiding principles, governance, etc. And on this slide, you see some key components of a solid interface strategy. One of the first things you should do before anything else, and this affects more than just interfaces, is to lay out your application landscape or your application portfolio. Understand all the current applications that you have in your enterprise and what their functionalities are. This helps you determine, based on the modules in the EPR you're implementing, which systems are going to be retired or sunsetted and which ones are going to stick around. And therefore, which ones will need to be integrated with. An inventory and rationalization of those applications is a really good first step. And it leads you directly into your first interface inventory. And this will serve as the master list of your overall interface scope. It's important to build these out because this type of document will tell you everything you need to know about what you're implementing, who's doing the work, and where the data is being sent. This should be maintained throughout the entire course of the project. In addition, you should have an understanding of the entire interface architecture, understanding the platforms and the engines involved, understanding the EPR, your ancillary systems, what they do, and the engine in the middle. Even things like your data warehouses that are present inside of an organization that are involved for legacy archive data and data reporting purposes. And Dan's going to talk through a lot of that stuff later, but it's important to understand where they fit in the context of an overall architecture of your enterprise. It should all be diagrammed and shared with your key constituents. Drawing a context diagram can help with this. It's sort of a data flow diagram on steroids, which I think we talked about earlier with one of those sun diagrams. But understanding where all the data grows visually is very, very helpful. In this phase, it's good practice to take stock of your staff as well, weigh them against an estimation model of your future state, understand which interfaces need to be developed, and then apply what staff you have to that work effort. This helps you identify gaps early on, both from a skills perspective but also from a pure work output view, so you understand where you're going to have gaps and where you might need to hire up. Finally, work with your downstream systems to identify what they may have going on from a parallel project standpoint, and understand what they have going on in their sort of critical path, and understand what clashes that they may have. So if you have to do work with them, you'll understand where they may or may not be able to work with you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so now that you have a strategy, it's time to build out the plan. An interface project lifecycle generally follows a very traditional software development lifecycle due to the very iterative nature of an EPR implementation. So your work plan should follow that cadence of design, build, test, cutover. Each phase builds upon the previous one, and because you build what you design, you test what you build, and you activate the entire solution. On the bottom, you can see some of the thumbnails of the artifacts that we typically use to manage a program like this. A project plan is vital and should be integrated with the larger overall program work plan. And like I said before, documents that you needed to maintain throughout the project, keep your inventory up to date, keep your context diagram up to date. And it's also really good to build what we like to call a critical path diagram. And that shows all of the work streams across the project in concert with each other to give you sort of a bird's eye view of the entire timeline. And you can start to line up what you're doing when you're doing your build, how it lines up with applications and testing team strategies and things like that. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're going to dig into each one of these phases that we just talked about and talk a little bit about some of the primary activities you see in each of these phases, the deliverables associated with that phase, and I've also tried to layer in some key considerations to think about along each step. The first phase is the design phase, and this is where the interface team will design its solutions. We've already touched upon some of the other activities that happen in this phase, like inventories of the interface and the diagrams, but the star of this particular show, in my mind, is the business requirements documentation. These tell the story of why we're building each particular interface and why it's being used. For those of you who deal maybe with more agile methodology, it's kind of like your personas and journeys. For example, you could document a situation like, as a pharmacist, I need my verified medication order to be sent to the automated dispensing systems, and then detailing why that needs to happen. Knowing this helps dictate how and why all of your messages are triggered. Some things to consider here: review your requirements with your EPR application subject matter experts, your clinical and application folks. Review them with your vendor representation. Make sure they all agree with what is being documented and what is planning to be built. Secondly, it's a good time to establish a very rigorous and clear interface change control process at this point. Throughout your implementation, you are going to get new interface requests the entire time. People are going to want to slip in their pet projects or try to get some, an ADT here or some data here. And the sooner you have a mechanism to handle those requests, the better off you will be. You don't have to say no to everything, but understand which one of these new interface requests are critical to patient care and which ones can be deferred to a later stage. Okay, next slide. This is the build phase. This is the next phase that comes after design, and this is where all the coding and the development happens. Here you will configure your EPR modules. The ancillary systems will be doing the build on their side of the house, and the interface engine will be built and coded to the specific requirements that you laid out in the previous phase. Here you're going to utilize a lot more technical documentation. These technical specifications that you're going to build to support the build of the interface include things like data mapping documents, which is a very granular field by field mapping, and it tells a story of where you receive data, where it needs to be moved, and where it's going to post in the downstream system. It tells them where they should expect to receive the data. It tells them how they're going to post it, how they're going to use it. In addition to build, I like to see everyone focus on unit testing as well in this phase to make sure they're testing all the initial components they're building out. When everything is built, it's good practice to do a level of connectivity testing, turn everything on and make sure you can talk to each other. And then I like to see an even more robust version of unit testing where messages get sent from end to end on each one of the interfaces. I like to build out scenario-based unit testing scripts here on this phase. Not everybody does that, but I like to see that. So you can test as many messages as possible and prove that they're posting data in the receiving systems appropriately. The more you can test up front in this phase, the less issues you'll have during the larger testing phases like integrating tests down the line. And speaking of testing, that is our next slide. When everything is built, and not just interfaces, while you build, application teams will be happening in concert. Everything comes together for the testing phase. And we've already done a full webinar on QA or testing, so I'm not going to rehash everything that's been said there, but this is where the rubber meets the road. Here, the interfaces will be part of functional testing, volume testing, mapped record testing, integrated testing, user acceptance testing. Anything that requires the movement of data will need interface involvement. The outputs in this phase are the completion of all the testing scripts that have interfaces involved. And along with that, closure of any defects that are open during these testing phases that need an interface fix. Things to consider here: stay close to the QA team throughout this process and be ready to fix defects ASAP. It's my experience, and I can say this firsthand, is in a past life, I was an interface developer way back when, and the first thing that people blame when things don't work is they come right to the interface team and blame them. And it's either our job to fix what's broken, or at the very least prove it's not our fault. So stay close to the QA team. Lastly, it's good practice to utilize a testing tool if you can. Most places use an ALM style testing tool to track your scripts, track your defects, track completion of everything that's going on. But it's better to work off something like that than pure spreadsheets. All right, next slide. And now we get to the cutover and the activation phase. And this is, here your interfaces are built, tested, and ready to be turned into a live production environment. The most important thing to consider here is your cutover plan. There will be a larger program level cutover plan, but the interface team needs to build one of their own. You should document every single interface that's being turned on, who's doing the work, and when it's happening, along with every step along the way. In many cases, these go lives happen in the middle of the night. So the more you can plan in advance, the less you have to think about at 3 a.m. when you're sleep deprived. Some additional things to consider here. Some of the interfaces, some of these can be turned on early or in sort of a soft live in advance of cutover. So find out which ones you can do that with and stage them early. The less things that are changing the night of go live, the better off you'll be. Make sure you staff cutover and beyond operational support appropriately. Things will break and we need people available to fix them. There's a level of 24/7 support that needs to happen for a while, but work with all the other teams to understand what kind of support we'll need and staff up appropriately. And finally, start thinking through the interfaces, those ones we talked about that you deferred in your change control meetings. Start building optimization waves for future releases down the line so people can start to see additional work that needs to happen beyond the actual go live. Okay, and I think we have one more slide that I wanted to talk about. And before we end this section, I wanted to touch upon just a handful of lessons learned that I thought would be really good information for you to consider just in general as you run an interface program. And we'll walk through them. Like I said up front, build a good estimation model to understand the level of effort you're going to need to build all the interfaces that you're going to have in your portfolio, and recruit staff early to meet that demand. This one's important. I think I've said it a couple of times, but I can't say it enough. Manage your scope tightly. Understand not only what people are asking for when they ask for new interfaces, but understand what the impact of any net new interface adds will have not only to your team, but to the overall program as well. Don't promise too much. Plan for engine upgrades. Just like your EPR, just like your downstream systems, you're going to have to upgrade your interface engine. Sometimes it even has to happen in the middle of the implementation before you even go live. Understand what that is, understand what the impact it's going to have, and try to minimize the impact of the overall program. Communicate as much as possible, early and often, with your clinical and application SMEs. Make sure everybody understands your requirements, make sure that they're baked into your build, and make sure they are part of the process end to end. Just like those folks, build in regular touch points with your interface business partners or your ancillary vendors to keep them apprised of what's going on from a project standpoint, all the activities you're doing. Let them know when they're needed to participate in, like testing or activation or whatever else. And lastly, and this also could be its own full-blown webinar, but data conversions is also a massive part of an EPR program. And a lot of times they're very tightly knit with interfaces. You're going to have to take legacy data and move that over in advance of the go live itself. And it's going to be really closely, tightly knit with your interface team. It might even be in some cases the same people doing that work. So make sure your plan lines up with their plan. A good example of that is if you're moving a lot of legacy lab results, you're going to convert a lot of that over, but that's also going to be paired directly with your net new real-time lab results interface. So understand how they interplay, when things need to be turned on, and how the mapping works with everything else. So with that, that's my content, and I'm going to hand it over here to my colleague Dan, and he's going to walk through reporting and analytics. So thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. Nice job. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be with you today to talk about reporting and analytics. And so next slide. As I talk to different groups about reporting and analytics, it's important to get a foundational understanding of what we mean by analytics. So in the context of today's webinar, traditional reporting is clearly a foundational capability, but it's not all. So, when we talk about what do we mean by analytics, it's that practice of transforming data. Again, Mitch talked about the importance of data into actionable insights to describe, predict, and improve business performance to deliver tangible business outcomes. I'm going to talk a little more about actionable insight because very relevant to the EPR systems that you're considering. Actionable insight, in my opinion, best delivered in the workflow of an individual who's qualified and authorized to apply a countermeasure in near real time. So a beautiful report that's delivered 6 months after the fact is potentially of some use, but it's not delivered in real time so that a countermeasure can be applied. So let's unpack a little bit of the framework here. Analytics maturity from low to high. On the right side here, you see in the red box really identifies the operational reporting. A lot of that comes out of the box, if you'll use that term, with your EPR vendor. And that is what we characterize as descriptive reporting. It's important, but many of your organizations may be considering, leading edge disruptive technology related to advanced analytics, machine learning, robotics, et cetera, and then things in between, predictive. What I like to say is that you really almost need to do all of this at once. It's not just a maturity model that you move up sequentially. So getting your data house in order, we're going to talk about the importance of data while you may be considering AI and ML. And some of your EPR vendors may have some of these modules, but there's been some studies recently, CIO Magazine, on why AI modules in projects fail. Data quality is often a major contributing factor. So the power of the word and. Do the basics and consider the disruptive advanced analytics. Let's go to the next slide. So we're talking today about EPR, which is an example of an enterprise class application. It's going to be a huge investment for your enterprise, too big to fail. And so it fits. So my point is, don't overlook the potential of that to contribute to the overall enterprise analytics rubric. Along with other transaction systems. It really is a catalyst for what you might be doing. And the good news, if this is your first EPR, is that these modern technologies have extensive reporting and analytics capabilities within them. So it's not just reports on paper anymore. It's not green bar. There are a lot of dashboards and things that interact live in the workflow. So consider those. Now, we're going to talk more about reference architecture, which is in the middle, but that is really how you connect all the components. So we're talking about the EPR. You may have another system dealing with operational analytics, financial, and research. And what I often say about EPR analytic capabilities is they're essential. They're essential to getting the value out of the investment you're about to make, but they're normally on their own not sufficient to render what you need for the whole enterprise from an analytics perspective. Let's continue to the next slide. So the insight-driven organization. So as you might think about your strategy going forward, you want to become more insight-driven. You know, why do this new EPR is going to collect and digitize a lot of data that today may be on paper, and but you want to be able to have more insight to make the good decisions that you make today. The IDEO framework is something that Deloitte has developed and refined, and what I like about it is that it's tested across industries and really across countries. And we have evidence of what good looks like for each of these hexagons that you see, the honeycombs, if you will. And we won't go through all of this today, but you know, again, analytics and reporting is important. We may want to come back to some of this in the Q&A. I think because of the time and the focus on reporting, I'm going to double click on process, data, and technology in the next bunch of slides. But your analytic strategy is also important, particularly as you think about things like the operating model, what things are centralized versus federated. And in people, it's often a common challenge to find the talent to manage these new things. Finally, last comment I'll make on this is that if you take a new project, and an EPR is not a good example, but sometimes analytics projects, if they come in at too extreme, either cool technology, you know, that's not balanced, or something that's very strategic that only works on PowerPoint, you don't get a good balance. So you really need to consider all of these panels as you think about your strategy. Next. So from a process perspective, so one, you know, the middle panel there, set of panels from the IDEO. We're going to talk a little bit about ideation and prioritization, governance. Mitch talked about that, as did Fran with the triangle. But, you know, in my career with IT, and I'm sure it's at your organization, you know, demand is insatiable and supply is finite. So how do you decide where to spend the available resources? So governance in that context is very important. Also in the middle there about process reengineering, it's important as you think about implementing your EPR that you consider as much as possible standardizing the workflow, especially if you're multi-entity and with diverse practices. You'll see in a couple of slides the importance of having standard workflow to having good quality data. And you may actually think about it in subsequent phases how RPA and intelligent automation might help you do some things if it's implemented right. And then data governance. Many of these EPRs have things like registries in them, embedded in them, and you know, collective organization decision making on what constitutes a diabetic patient, for example, and when is important to your overall decision. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So this may be beyond the approach that you'll take to the classic reporting that comes with an EPR, but those of you who've been doing digital development might be familiar with the concept of design thinking. And it really is that structured approach. Mitch talked about personas and use cases and hybrid agile, you know, really where the bucket of requirements never empties, but that you're building suites of dashboards that make the work easier to do for a particular persona. So a nurse manager, for example, gets in a particular suite of dashboards all that he or she needs to do their job, as opposed to having to click on 7 different dashboards that happen to sit on piles of data. Next slide. Another leading practice, and again, this kind of comes out of the digital development rather than the classic EPR implementations, but the notion of foundry operations. So scale up for reliability and repeatability using pods. So the concept of a pod is a team pulled together full or part-time for a particular function. And so they're a fixed capacity. And then as work comes through, they get it done with quality and reliability because they're used to working together. And at an organization, you can flex the number of pods based on demand. And some of those are hybrid agile comments that are, again, topic for another webinar. This is one, we talked about people. I didn't go too much into it, but this is a good way. We talk about talent. Typically, like we talk about red people who know the business and blue people who know the technology. And then the notion of purple people are those very few in your organization who know both. This is a way to simulate the power of purple people with pods. Next slide. So we're going to move then from process to data. And these are some of the dimensions from IDEO of what good looks like. It's almost like security, in my view, that it's the pursuit of data excellence it never really ends. So if this is your first EPR, this will be among your top challenges, is getting the data right. Talk a little bit about the data model, data quality, and then ethics. But in terms of the data models, and when you're talking about packaged software, each of these vendors has their own file structure and data model, if you will. In the US, it's not uncommon, as a former CIO, to have hundreds, literally 200 or more applications in the portfolio, each with their own data model. So, how do you conjure up what you need for enterprise analytics? And there's some good news there with some of the new data platforms I'll touch on. Data quality, I talked a little bit about that, such as data governance and when is a diabetic patient, but other things like length of stay. There may be multiple right reasons why a physician's address. There may be one for clinic hours and another for hospital hours. And then finally, ethics and sharing. More and more today with the involvement of some of the big hyperscalers like Google and Azure and AWS, growing with global pharma, very interested in the data that comes out of the health systems. Your thoughts for your organization, what's unique to you about the ethics associated with sharing that and under what conditions? Next. This is one of my favorites. Actually developed this on my whiteboard during the heat of battle with some major data quality problems. And I refer to this as the value chain of data excellence. And I think it's important in this context when you think about the EPR, from the left in early data governance implementation, what's important? Is the data relevant? Is it understood? You may or may not have a data dictionary yet to define it specifically, but have we configured it as we build the system correctly? And then remember the importance of the workflow. Is the workflow reliable such that we've got a good shot of capturing this data a high percentage of time with reliability and quality? And then the analytics work takes up. Is it calculated? Do we know the numerator and denominator? Can we say that the data sources are certified? And then is it available? Remember actionable insight. Do I have access to get to it? And ultimately, is there clarity and confidence? One of the things you want to avoid is having people lose faith in the quality of your data as you bring out a new system. Next. So the life cycle of data management, I've talked about a little bit of this, but from a maturity perspective, it's really these capabilities that you should consider simultaneously as you plan, invest, and then implement both your EPR as well as enterprise analytics. So I've talked about data governance, if you look up at the top, and data architecture. There's some good news relative to what was the case 10 years ago. You had to build a traditional data warehouse, and that took 18 to 24 months. And typically by the time you finish that, the questions that the business had changed. And so their modern data platforms allow you to curate the data just the right amount and only for the data for specific use cases. So there's some good news there. I'll talk a little bit about that. Data retention and archiving. Mitch talked about data and conversions. And then in the US in particular, some of our organizations are on their second or third generation EPR. And for regulatory requirements and for research, you need to keep track of data that was gathered along the way. It's also relevant with acquisitions. Data quality, it's almost like the water department. You want to have a certifiable level of quality for key subsets of data. Not all data needs to be certifiable for drinking, but as long as you know it's the best available and maybe it's market data, you use it accordingly. There are products in this space that you may be familiar with globally, like Informatica, Cloudera, that help with the data quality. Metadata management, that's data about data, including things like catalogs. We talked about reporting and analytics primarily today. Reference and master data management. So again, in pursuit of data excellence, perhaps keeping a golden record on providers across your enterprise, especially if you're coming together, or locations, or even patients. And then data privacy and security. The data is not, especially with what you exchange with outside entities, there's quite a bit to consider here with regard to security. Let's continue. So technology, the last of the IDEO panels I'll double click on, talked about the good news with the data platforms versus the traditional EDW. So these really enable analytics ecosystems comprising innovative technologies. There's quite a mix of proprietary, open source, and licensed software that comes into play in these architectures. So you shouldn't be afraid of that. The disruptors, I mentioned the hyperscalers like Microsoft, Google, AWS, and others, cloud platforms, and then the reference architecture, the piece of the donut that was missing when we talked about the reference, the EPR in context. Let's go to the next slide. So when you think about a reference architecture in the context of reporting and analytics, this is a simple one. I like to use this with executive audiences. You think of it left to right, collecting the data, curating the data, making it a little more organized or standardized, calculating, so numerators and denominators, and then consuming either a dashboard or a report. Now your EPR is going to have capabilities to do a lot of this end to end within that particular platform. And in your current state, you may be collecting and curating data through chart abstraction if you're on a manual system. But there are tools out there that allow a lot of this to happen in a more automated and a more industrial strength fashion. So today, it's not uncommon in the States for someone to get assigned to do a special study, and they start right to left. Okay, so I've got Tableau or Qlik or some cool whiz-bang dashboarding tool, and I go finding the data, and it might take me 28 days to find the data for a board meeting. And the day I print that report, it's obsolete because there's not a sustainable ecosystem for that data to be available next. Let's go a little deeper on that in the next slide. And this will be my last slide today. But in terms of that reference architecture, so the collect, curate, calculate, and consume, as you see across the top, there are some examples of source systems, and these are just examples. You see Epic in there. You see Mosaic, which is a common in the States for oncology, to be able to extract that data and bring it into a data platform, not just right into a data warehouse. Varying levels of curation, from raw data to curated to possibly enriched. So you may have a function that's pulling in outside data to enrich what you capture. And then different shared zones. What is the certified source of data for the enterprise to do calculations on things like quality or length of stay? And then different tenant zones. I like to describe that almost like the community garden patch. So Heart and Vascular can have their zone, and they can use that the way they want it, again, subject to the enterprise standards, and not conflict with orthopedics or oncology, et cetera. And then in consumption, the data delivery, whether it's ad hoc through alerts, portals, et cetera. And these architectures deal not just with the scheduled execution or extraction of data, but some of the things Mitch talked about with APIs and streaming. So if you're doing calculations on the risk of sepsis, you want to be able to take information from your devices in near real time and to get the early monitoring. And so, like I said, there's good news out here. So we've come quite a way from reporting as it relates to your EPR, but I wanted to leave you with some thoughts about making sure you do the best job you can, early governance for data, and don't just replicate the reports that you have historically. And with that, I'll conclude. Hopefully we'll have some questions and conversation.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much, Mitch, as well. So really expert articulation, both of what we can do to optimize our EPR implementations, but also how then we can look forward to the future of advanced analytics and other capabilities to use those data to provide insights to improve care. So very, very grateful to you both. Thank you very much. So we've got some great questions coming in, and just encourage people on the line to add any more questions into the Q&A. So Mitch, I just wanted to ask you about legacy data. So you touched on it very briefly in terms of making sure that you understand where legacy data is, and you said indeed that data migration could be its own webinar in itself. Can you tell me, in your experience in some of your large implementations, what are the considerations around the availability of legacy data, and also, how do we make those legacy data available to people using the new EPR in the best possible way?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I could probably answer this question. It'd probably take me 10 minutes to answer it like everything that I can think of here. But I think that the big ones to consider is, when you look at it's just like anything else. You got a current state and a future state. You look at your current state, what data you want to move into your future state EPR. You don't need, like, let's say you've got stuff going back 20 years in the lab system, and you've got images that are 15 years in the radiology. Like, you don't need all of that, right? You only need a certain amount, but you need to make a decision about how much you want to move. Generally, a lot of these EPRs will say, we only really need about 3 years of data to make effective clinical decisions on whatever patient. And in any case that you might need more than 3 years, then you can go put it in one of Dan's data stores, and we can go find it later. Like, we can do some sort of a lookup that can pull the data that's older than 3 years old and find a way to compare it. You can do whatever, like, analytical runs against it, you can. But those kinds of key decisions need to happen really early on. You need to sit with your clinical advisory council, with your physicians, the people that will be actually using the data, and make sure that they agree. This is the data that I want. This is the stuff that I need to see. This is how far back I need to look. And then you can build everything off of that moving forward. So then, all right, we have 3 years of lab data. I'm going to go grab it. I'm going to move it over. It's going to take me, 3 weeks to move that data because it's 16 million transactions or whatever it is. And all of that sort of needs to be built into your plan, right? And paired with an interface, like we said. Those are probably the ones that I would say first to think about as from a data conversion standpoint. And it applies across the board. Understanding what data you have, how clean it is. Because you could say, I want 3 years of data, and it could be garbage, right? And it's not going to do you any good to move it. But how clean it is, what it's going to take to move it over, what it needs to look like when it posts, and who needs to use it, which in my mind is the most important, is work with your stakeholders.
And
Great.
Mitch, if I could pile on just quickly, in terms of the needs, so clearly I agree with the 3 years for clinical decision-making. Depending on the regulatory environment, there may be legal medical record needs that go beyond that. In the States, it's 21 years after the age of majority. So we have a legal medical record need that goes beyond that 3 years. And then you have to determine, if you do an archive system just for that, how do you make that data available? Is there effective an easy button for a doctor who's moved from the legacy system to the new system to help with the change management? And then the last thing I'll mention is that probably things that we weren't thinking about 5 years ago is the value of legacy data for machine learning. Last decade's trash is this decade's gold. So potentially.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's a huge source there, isn't it, to teach your machines and provide some really amazing insights to care. So another question we've got coming through is about device integration. And Mitch, I think this might be one for you around how do you what are the things that you should consider in choosing that right solution to support the integration of your medical devices? You mentioned a little bit, but there's definitely more interest in understanding how you make that choice.
Yeah, let me get myself off mute. Yeah, so device integration is, it's a pretty complex work thread. You need, and I've always seen like someone get really deep and specialist in medical devices, and I only know about 2 of those people that in the entire industry that know this much about medical devices. But it's its own sort of work thread. I think we talked about some of the vendors in the space. And there's a range of them. I listed a couple of them out. I think some of them is consolidated, and there's maybe GE has something, and Capsule and Masimo, and there's a number of different things out there. I think what you need to think about is what middleware vendor works best with the solution you're going to have. There's software solutions that are out there. There's hardware solutions, and then there's hybrid solutions. And I think, without being able to tell you which one I think is the best, I think it's going to have to be weighed against what you have and what your current state is. A hybrid solution allows integration and connectivity with the devices. It consolidates everything using software and the actual capsule style hardware and sends it in. I think I've seen both utilized to great success. I think what you'd want to do is probably sit down and do an analysis of your current state, the people that you have, with the devices you're going to integrate, and figure out what works best for you.
Sure, no, absolutely. In the same vein, Dan, there's a question here around enterprise data platforms, and again, what if you're looking to buy one or to work with a vendor and to sit that on top of your EPR? What are the key considerations and any advice you have for people who are really trying to make that important decision?
So I think that, in my opinion, the best advice is that your inventory of use cases drive the requirements for the data platform. So one of my project teams with a client created a catalog of 67 use cases from across the stakeholder group. And as I went through it personally, I think they were a little disappointed, because I thought about 70% of those could be addressed by the EPR or the ERP system, so the enterprise transaction system, that they really didn't need to fill anything in the donut hole in the middle. So what are those use cases that require a scoop of clinical data with operational data, perhaps research? And so I think those requirements drive the selection, and the marketplace for those vendors is explosive. And as I mentioned, it's rarely a single vendor purchase. It's probably not something you're just going to go buy from IBM anymore, with a data model and everything all in the appliance. And that's part of how you can future-proof your investment. It takes a little more technical savvy, if you will, but it's a mix of open source and licensed software. And then the cloud comes into that too. So the scalers, you probably don't want to buy a data platform that's on-prem, because part of what you get there is the flexibility on storage and scalability.
Great, thank you very much. Now we've got a question coming in here about that one of the age-old challenges that we all have as we've worked in the industry in a number of different roles, and that's around talent. So Dan, I know that there's a huge and ferocious market for talent out there in data and analytics, but do you have any advice for CIOs really looking to build that analytics capability in their organization? What's the blend between external hires and building your own, and how would you use clinician insight and capability in those teams as you develop them?
I guess I'll start, and I'll let Mitch comment. I mentioned the notion of purple people, right? Red and blue.
Mm.
Red knowing the business, blue knowing the technology. So how do you find the purple people? How do you share them? How do you recruit, retain? How do you develop? And it really depends on the enterprise. I think I've always been a fan of hiring new grads in the mix. They're blank slates. They'll learn whatever you need them to learn in the mix. And so I do think it's you mentioned also clinicians and the notion of those pods that I talked about to be able to pull clinicians in. I know the EPR vendors have significant roles for clinicians. One of the challenges is most clinicians aren't project oriented, so they're not used to proceeding with a plan. They're used to asking for what they want and hoping to get it, immediately. So, but that skill set, in the design and configuration of the EPR, you can't do it without them. And it's not just it's nursing, it's techs in the labs, your OR suites, along with the physicians.
Thanks, Dan. The key message there around hire and train and develop, and then perhaps secure some of those skills and capabilities that are very niche through lateral hires or through external advice. So that's brilliant. Thank you again so much to you both. It's really been fascinating and very exciting because this opens the way really for a whole universe of data to help us provide insight to improve care for patients, which is the aim of everything that we're doing here as part of the EPR implementation webinar series. So I'd like now to just talk about two last things. Firstly, to say that we do have some more resources to support you as you navigate some of the key strategic decisions that you have into the future. We've got a number of reports that are available on our website, and they also focus on some of the challenges that are coming forward. So look out on this website from the Deloitte Centre for Health Solutions on our upcoming report on the future of public health, something that's been very much to the fore in the months and years that we've lived through with COVID-19. So moving then to our close. Thank you again for joining from around the world and whatever time zone you are. It's been a pleasure to host you this afternoon. Thank you to Dan and to Mitch, our excellent speakers, and thank you to you for asking those questions. We have our next webinar on Thursday, the 29th of July, and we'll be looking at that period after you've gone live. How do you sustain and how do you optimize? There are always things that need to be updated, changed, always challenges that you need to address in the post-go live period. So we'll be focusing on structuring your team and building your capability to deal with that immediate go live period. So please do join us on the 29th of July between 4 and 5 p.m. If you would like to listen to any of the previous webinars, they are all on the web page listed below, and you can download them and listen again. So thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing or meeting with you again on the 29th of July. Good afternoon.